In our episodes, we discuss cases and topics that might be distressing or disturbing to some listeners. Listener discretion is advised. Last week, we covered the brutal murder of 4-year-old Eric Christgen, abducted and killed on Friday, May 26, 1978. Police arrested Melvin Reynolds, who was later convicted, even as doubts about the confession, the investigation, and the evidence remained. That episode was part of our continued look at serial killer Charles Hatcher, who we introduced 2 weeks ago. And now, we know what investigators would only learn much later. Charles Hatcher, not Melvin Reynolds, was the man who killed Eric Christgen. So that raises a critical question. If the wrong man was behind bars, what was Charles Hatcher doing in those years? That's what we are digging into today. Hatcher is suspected of killing as many as 16 people, yet he was only ever convicted of 2. We've already talked about Eric Christgen's case, and later in this episode we'll break down how investigators ultimately linked him to that crime. But first, we're going to look at what Hatcher was doing right after Eric Christgen's murder, and the second murder he was convicted of, the killing of Michelle Steele. Let's get started. In the months and years following the murder of 4-year-old Eric Christgen, while police repeatedly interrogated Melvin Reynolds, while Melvin was in and out of court proceedings, while his trial was ongoing, and while he was being brutally beaten and sexually assaulted in prison, Charles Hatcher was assaulting boys across the Midwest. Between September of 1978 and March of 1982, Hatcher was arrested for multiple offenses. In Omaha, Nebraska, he attempted to stab a 7-year-old boy, he molested a teen, and got into some sort of fight relating to paying a man for sex. Hatcher molested a man in Lincoln, Nebraska, and attempted to stab another guy in Des Moines, Iowa. And in Bettendorf, Iowa, he tried to kidnap an 11-year-old boy. In this attempted abduction in Bettendorf, Iowa, the 11-year-old boy named Todd went to a grocery store for his mom, and as he was grabbing what he needed, this man came up behind him, and started accusing him of stealing. Now, the man said he was a security guard and started ushering Todd out the back of the store, through an employees-only door and outside. Todd was insisting he didn't steal anything, and then Todd became concerned when this man started pushing him across the parking lot and towards a wooded area. Todd broke away from the guy, ran off and found an actual security guard, who then called police. They arrested the man, Charles Hatcher, but who went by the name Richard Clark. Terry Gainey's book, Innocent Blood, A True Story of Obsession and Serial Murder, which I have used as my primary source for most of these episodes on Hatcher, I'll have it linked in the show notes, said that despite all of these incidents, Hatcher never went to prison. Similar to how he was able to weasel his way out of the system in California, he was able to get out of jail for all of these crimes. And there were a lot of factors playing into this. And really, the story of Hatcher's crimes includes just a multitude of cracks and failures of our legal system. But there was a lot complicating the situation. For one, it was the 70s and 80s. I just don't think there were good systems in place for keeping track of people. And it didn't help that Hatcher never went by his real name. He always had fake IDs, and he always used aliases. Also, none of the jails he went to ever processed his fingerprints. So there was no way of realizing that all of these different crimes in different jurisdictions by men with different names were actually the same person. There were just systemic failures all around. And it's really unfortunate because so much of this could have been avoided, and so many families and victims spared from the horror Hatcher inflicted on them. Now, just like we went over, in the 4 years following Eric Christgen's murder, Hatcher was committing crimes in Nebraska and Iowa. But he eventually gets back to St. Joseph, Missouri in the summer of 1982. On Tuesday, July 27th, 1982, a woman named Stephanie Ritchie was in the downtown area of St. Joseph near a mall, not even a block away from where Eric Christgen had been abducted 4 years prior, when a strange man came up to her and was pestering her to go get coffee with him. Terry Gainey's book specifically said she was accosted by the man. Stephanie told the guy to leave her alone. The next day, Wednesday, July 28th, a 10-year-old boy named Carrie was at a mall outside of St. Joseph with his grandmother. While Carrie had gone into a record store and was looking around, a man came up behind him, grabbed him by the shoulder, accused him of stealing, and tried pushing him outside of the store in the mall. Exactly what had happened to Todd in Bettendorf. Carrie broke off and ran, found his grandmother, and they called police. But by the time they got there, the man was gone. Then, on Thursday, July 29th, 1982, a familiar and horrific series of events plays out in St. Joseph. Annette Steele got home from work around 3:15 p.m. that day, and she was immediately concerned. Her 11-year-old daughter, Michelle, wasn't home. Annette spoke with her brother, called her friends, but no one had seen her. Now, Michelle had a dental appointment earlier that day that she had gone to by herself. So Annette calls the dentist office and they confirm that, yeah, Michelle made it in for her 10:30 a.m. appointment and had left around 11:25. Annette then called Michelle's father, Leonard, to see if maybe she had gone to see him. He said he hadn't seen his daughter at all that day. Now, both of them are concerned, and they joined forces to search for her. They went to the downtown building where her dental appointment was to try and retrace her steps. The building was just around the corner from where Stephanie Ritchie had been accosted by a man just days prior. After no luck finding Michelle, just after 4 p.m., they call police and report her missing. Unfortunately, it's hardly the quick spring into action that we saw with Eric Christgen. In fact, I actually find it quite sick how Michelle's parents were treated here initially. It wasn't that police did nothing, but there were a few comments from the police chief Hayes, that were so out of pocket and rude, and we will get into that. Now, a bulletin was put out stating she was missing, but it wasn't until 7:15 p.m. that officers came down around the dental office where they found no trace of her. Now, by 9 p.m., a group of about 65 volunteers began searching around the downtown area, and it wasn't until 11 p.m. that police officially declared Michelle a missing person. Apparently because it had been more than 12 hours since anyone had last seen her, which again, these are such outdated and ridiculous rules. Now, back to the police chief, Chief Hayes. The same police chief who became irate at a police officer in the Eric Christgen case when they brought up concerns that they had arrested the wrong guy, that same police chief. Hayes goes over to the Steele home at midnight to question the parents. They all sat in the living room. Chief Hayes says, quote, "It's possible that she ran away to teach you both a lesson." Like, what lesson? What are you talking about? And now, the Steele parents knew that this was not the case. There was no reason for her to have run away. They knew something bad had happened. Michelle was outgoing and friendly, yes, but she was cautious, extremely cautious. She would never go anywhere with a stranger. Annette actually recalled a moment not long before Michelle went missing where Michelle made a comment on a TV show plot that involved a kidnapping and said, quote, "If something like that ever happened to me, Mom, I'd holler until someone paid attention to me and came to help me. And if that didn't work, I'd run." So Annette knew this wasn't the case. She wouldn't run away. She wouldn't go anywhere with a stranger willingly. Annette went over the story of the day with Chief Hayes. She relayed how Michelle had a dental appointment downtown and how she had gone on the bus into the appointment by herself. Chief Hayes said, according to Terry Gainey's book, "What kind of a mother are you to let your little girl go down there alone? Don't you know about all the perverts down there?" Can you believe? I am seeing red just reading this. I'm sorry, but what kind of police chief are you where your downtown is full of perverts? I just cannot believe that someone would say something like that to them. That's insane. But anyways, the search intensifies that night and continues into the next morning. There were volunteers searching high and low. One of the searchers was Roy Montgomery, Michelle's uncle. He actually had shingles at the time he was helping search, so he was moving slowly and was in pain. But he continued. He was worried about his niece and also had this sense of anger over how police had treated this case. Gainey's book said he felt that they had been, quote, a bit cavalier about the search. But he trudged along and eventually met up with a group of searchers who had discovered a tennis shoe along the edge of a river. They showed him the shoe and he believed it was Michelle's. Police brought the shoe to Annette Steele, who confirmed it was her daughter's. Roy continued along the riverbank, trampling through weeds and brush, when he noticed an area where the weeds had already been pushed down. He continued and found footprints. In Terry Gainey's book, Roy is quoted as saying, quote, "I don't know how far I walked, but I came to a tree I could not get around. So I went down to the river and walked along the river until I saw a broken tree, and I went back up the bank. Just a little north of there, I saw what looked like a hollowed out place, like maybe a tree had fallen. I looked over there and saw something white between the two logs, and I walked over to it. I looked down between the logs, and I saw Michelle laying there. Michelle was lying nude in the fetal position. Roy ran screaming for help, saying he had found her, that she was dead." Just like with the disappearance and murder of Eric Christgen, local media was quickly at the scene. But unlike the Christgen case, the Steele parents were not given the horrific news that their daughter had been murdered by police themselves. Because Michelle's uncle had found her body, police considered that to be the family being informed. Annette and Leonard Steele found out their daughter had been murdered from a local news anchor on television. An autopsy performed on Michelle showed that she had been beaten, sexually assaulted, and bitten multiple times. They believed her cause of death was asphyxiation, but it was unclear exactly how. Marks on her wrist indicated she may have been bound for a time. Now, unlike the Christgen case where it took time to identify a suspect, police had a clear idea almost immediately of who was responsible for Michelle's murder. See, before her body had been found, a police officer who had been called on to help the search ran into a strange man walking near the river. The officer stopped and asked what the guy's name was and if he had seen a little girl. The guy said his name was Richard Harris and that he hadn't seen anyone. Now, the officer let him go, but saw him just a little bit later near where some guys were fishing. Another detective also questioned this Richard Harris, checked to see if he had any outstanding warrants, which he didn't, so they let the guy go as well. Now, after Michelle's body was found, some of these officers had realized that they saw the same strange man very close to where her body was found, so they put out a wanted bulletin for this man. Then, just by happenstance, a security guard working at the St. Joseph State Mental Hospital, located just 20 blocks from the river, heard a police broadcast on the radio describing this man named Richard Harris. The description of the man stood out to the security officer because just that morning, Friday morning, a guy had walked into the lobby of the hospital, sat in a chair, held his head, and kept screaming over and over, "Make the voices quit, stop them, I can't stand it, they're scaring me." Nursing staff and the security guard couldn't get the guy to calm down, but they found an ID in his wallet that said Richard Clark from Davenport, Iowa. They asked if he wanted help, and this guy said yes, and so he was voluntarily admitted to the mental hospital. So when the security officer hears the description of the man they are looking for in connection with this murder, even though they call him Richard Harris, the description is just like the Richard Clark that had come in earlier that day. So the security guard calls police at 1:10 p.m. on Friday. 2 detectives go, and one of them was the one that had questioned this weird man by the river, confirms that's the same guy. The other cop who saw him walking also confirmed that was the guy, so they detain him at the hospital. They confiscate his clothing and backpack, which had nylon rope in it. They take a photo of the man and they show it to both Stephanie Ritchie and Carrie, the little boy who had almost been kidnapped at the mall, and both confirm that this was the guy that they had just seen days prior. Now, in the book, they keep referring to him as Clark. I don't know at what point they realize it's Hatcher. At a certain point, they do. Gainey says when they eventually arrest him and charge him with first-degree murder, some people at the police station recognized Hatcher from his earlier criminal days in St. Joseph, but I'm just going to refer to him as Hatcher from here on out. So they book Hatcher, and the evidence against him is enough, right? They think it's strong enough. They compared the bite marks on Michelle's body to his teeth, and that matched. The print on his shoes matched a footprint near her body. Witnesses placed him at the scene. There was strong evidence against him. Now, while they were compiling this evidence, some detectives started wondering if there was a connection between Michelle Steele's murder and Eric Christgen's. If you remember, there were officers and detectives during the investigation portion of Eric's case who were skeptical that Melvin Reynolds was responsible. But there were also still those who were adamant that Melvin was the right guy. And I think a lot of that is probably due to pride, and because there was so much pressure during the Christgen case to get it solved, that many detectives and officers were willing to look beyond the glaring holes in the case against Melvin Reynolds. Now that Charles Hatcher is in jail awaiting trial, he's being evaluated for his competency to stand trial, and they're evaluating his mental state, all of that. But on May 3rd, 1983, Hatcher does something that changes the course of Melvin Reynolds' life and shines a light on the extent of his depravity. He hands sheriff's deputies a piece of paper. On it, he had scribbled, quote, "Please call the FBI and tell them that I'd like to see them today. Very important case." This is when FBI agent Holtzlag comes back into the picture. He meets with Charles Hatcher at the Buchanan County Jail, and Hatcher, still refusing to speak, which Holtzlag knew was an act, pulls out a piece of paper. On the paper is a map of the Quad Cities region, which encompasses Davenport and Bettendorf, Iowa, and Moline and Rock Island, Illinois. The bottom half of the paper has directions written down. It said, quote, "Going from Rhode Island toward Davenport, on the right side of the bridge, on the Arsenal side of the bridge, there's a guardrail on the right side. About the middle of the rail, look toward the bank. There's a level area. Walk about 10 feet to the bank. Look down the bank about 5 feet. There's a steel rod sticking out. Go under the rod and look to your left about 2 feet. Dig under the rocks. You will find a body." Holtzlag asked a few more questions about the body, and Hatcher answered by writing down that the body was a male, an adult, and buried in June of 1981. Hatcher said, "Come back after you find it. You find the body, then we will talk. This isn't bullshit. This is all for now, okay?" And the meeting ends. Holtzlag passes the information on to Illinois authorities, and sure enough, a body is found in that location. It was decomposed enough that no cause of death was able to be determined. Now, it really seemed that Hatcher, who for most of his life feigned severe mental illness, had something he wanted to confess to authorities, but knew well enough that they might not believe him. So he showed them to a body to show them that he was telling the truth in whatever else it was he wanted to talk about. Holtzlag met with Hatcher again, said they found a body, and said, quote, "You've got my complete and undivided attention." Hatcher revealed the man they found was 34-year-old James Churchill from Galesburg, Illinois. Churchill had been diagnosed as mentally and developmentally disabled as a child, which they believed was from his mother contracting measles while pregnant with him. Churchill had run-ins with police throughout his life, but then in June of 1981 disappeared. Hatcher told Holtzlag that Churchill was a friend of his and that he was killed because of a, quote, robbery. Now, the second meeting with Hatcher was confusing. You can read about all the details in Terry Gainey's book, which I will link, but Hatcher kept going back and forth and giving answers. He would either give an answer or he'd be like, "No, I need more time." Holtzlag believed that Hatcher was gearing up to make a big confession about the Michelle Steele case. But then Hatcher said that he gave the agent directions to the body, quote, "because it leads to yet another one, like you just found. More than one, but I'm thinking about it, okay?" And he just kept saying that. There were multiple bodies. And he also kept referring to a body, quote, "like you just found." Holtzlag didn't know what to make of it. He didn't understand what Hatcher meant by this. He kept trying to keep the interview going, recognizing for some reason Hatcher trusted him, and he didn't want to say anything wrong to have him shut down completely. This went on for about an hour and a half. Then Holtzclag asked, quote, "When was this other body found that you keep referring to?" Hatcher said, "I know. So do you know about it?" Holtzclag at first didn't understand. The sentence didn't make sense. He didn't know what he was referring to. But Holtzclag read the sentence over and over. He thought of all the murders he had worked on in his career. And he looked at Hatcher. Then something came to him. The description of a man from a witness. An old man, seen walking with a 4-year-old blonde boy. And this nagging thought he had had in his head from the moment he saw Hatcher during that first meeting made sense. He recognized Hatcher. Agent Holtzclag said, "Eric Christgen," and Hatcher smiled. Hatcher eventually told Holtzclag that there were 16 bodies total, but he needed time and would only divulge the details of the bodies and of Eric Christgen if he received the death penalty. Hatcher wanted to die. He said it was the only way to stop all of this from happening again. For months, Hatcher spent time writing down what he said were details of his murders and crimes on paper, but he wouldn't show anyone. Not the jailers, not his attorneys, not Agent Holtzclag. And for months, Holtzclag kept trying to meet with Hatcher to get those details, but he never got them. And then, on June 3rd, 1983, when officers at the jail searched Hatcher's cell, they were looking for contraband. It appeared to be a standard search, but Hatcher thought Holtzclag had betrayed him, that they were coming for his papers with the details of his crimes before he was ready to share them. He flushed the papers down the toilet. Just when Holtzclag thought all progress with Hatcher had been lost, he received a letter from Hatcher on July 27th. It was a full confession of the Eric Christgen murder. The letter is written in full in Terry Gainey's book, and it is so sad. He recounts Eric Christgen's last moments. I'll spare the back and forth that ensued from this. Of course, the prosecutor who tried the Christgen case against Melvin Reynolds thought this was all BS. He thought Holtzclag was being conned. It took a lot to get Reynolds out of prison. A lot of convincing. In Gainey's book, it said, quote, "Up until the Hatcher case, Holtzclag felt a deep trust in his fellow lawmen. He thought they would always work together. Holtzclag said, I was naive to think that everybody would work just as hard to get an innocent man out as they would to put a guilty one in. But they could give a shit." But eventually, Melvin Reynolds is let out of prison. On November 21st, the conviction is reversed and the charges dismissed. After years of being in prison for a crime he didn't commit, being repeatedly beaten and sexually assaulted by other inmates, Melvin Reynolds was finally a free man. But nothing can bring back the time he lost and what he went through in prison. So, Hatcher said he killed 16 people. He told Agent Holtzclag he killed 3 kids and 13 adults, and that the murders began in the 1960s. He said, quote, "I kill on impulse. It's an uncontrollable urge that builds and builds over a period of weeks until I have to kill. It doesn't matter if the victims are men, women, or children. Whoever is around is in trouble." He eventually admitted he stabbed James Churchill to death, that despite the man being a friend of his, he just got an overwhelming urge to kill him. Hatcher also admitted to murdering a boy in California. He said he had watched 2 boys, one of them 12-year-old William Freeman, riding their bikes on August 28, 1969. He got William in the car with him, drove down by a creek, got out, and strangled the boy. This was just days before he brutally attacked the other California boy we talked about in the previous episode. Hatcher said if it weren't for the man who walked by and saw him, he would have killed that boy too. Hatcher eventually went to trial for the murder of Michelle Steele and was found guilty. For sentencing, Hatcher did everything he could to try and convince the jury to sentence him to death. He addressed the jury himself and said, quote, "If you believe the prosecutor's allegations are true, you have only one job. If you think I did this, you have one job. You have to make sure it doesn't happen again. I have a record of escapes. I may try it. You must prevent it from happening again." His defense attorneys urged the jury to choose life in prison, despite Hatcher's own wish to die. Ultimately, the jury reached their decision after less than an hour of deliberating. They sentenced Hatcher to a life in prison without the possibility of parole. This was definitely a controversial decision that angered many. They wanted Hatcher to pay for his crimes with his life. But maybe Hatcher's own push and insistence that he die persuaded the jury against it. Maybe sentencing him to sit in a cell for the rest of his life was a greater punishment than death. Agent Holtzlag met with Charles Hatcher one more time. Hatcher was angry. He wanted the death penalty and seemed to think that Holtzlag didn't uphold his part of whatever bargain he believed they had. Holtzlag said they made a deal to talk about the other murders. Hatcher said, "I've got nothing more to say to you." On December 7th, 1984, Charles Hatcher hung himself in his prison cell, and that was that. He got his wish for death, but the names of the other victims of his crimes died with him. We know he murdered Jerry Tharrington in prison. He murdered James Churchill in Illinois. He murdered Eric Christgen and Michelle Steele in St. Joseph, Missouri. He murdered William Freeman in California. That leaves 11 more people, if you believe Hatcher's own number of 16. And I tend to believe it. He told the truth about Churchill and Freeman, and he confessed to Christian. And this is the end of our look at Charles Hatcher and his crimes. This has been an interesting one to research. We started with examining his life to answer the question of whether or not he was responsible for Dorothy Miller's murder in 1969, which he wasn't. But with all of his crimes as a whole, we saw the cracks in our legal system on full display. We saw the consequences of the antiquated systems of the 60s and 70s and departments not processing fingerprints. We saw the consequences of giving someone leniency despite medical evaluations and opinions stating he was a danger to society. We saw the consequences of poor interrogation techniques and tunnel vision with the conviction of Melvin Reynolds. I do believe a lot has changed since this time. I think there's been so much more research done on treatment for sex offenders. Better systems have been put in place for tracking them. We know so much more about false confessions. There's better reporting mechanisms for child abductions. There has been progress. This case, though, leaves me with a lot of questions. Some specifically about Hatcher's life, like what was the turning point? How did he go from car thefts to violent murder? There's a lot to unpack. I do know, though, that this case has once again reaffirmed my position in being staunchly against the death penalty. That might sound odd given the horrific nature of Hatcher's crimes, but it's because of people like Melvin Reynolds, because of the holes and cracks in our justice system that once again make me believe we should never resort to execution. According to the Death Penalty Information Center, since 1973, 200 former death row prisoners have been exonerated of all charges, or found to have been wrongfully convicted. The thought that even one innocent person could be executed, to me, is not worth society's overwhelming desire for vengeance. I 100% understand the arguments people make in favor of the death penalty, but none to me make it worth one innocent person being killed by the government. It wasn't really the takeaway I thought I would have from researching this case and Charles Hatcher's crimes, but that was my takeaway, and the reminder that our legal system is flawed, and it will never be perfect, but I am so glad for the people who fight each day to make it better and more just. Let me know what your takeaway was on this 3-part series. Next week, we will be back to try and rule out another potential person who could have been responsible for the murder of Dorothy Miller. Mike DeBardelibin. We will see you next week. Thank you for listening to this episode of Cardinal Crimes. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing, giving us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcast, and sharing this episode with others. You can find us on TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram with the handle @CardinalCrimes, and you can send us any case suggestions, questions, or topics you would like covered there or to our email, cardinalcrimes@gmail.com. Until next time, friends, take care of each other and take care of yourself. If you've ever thought about starting your own podcast, there's no better place to begin than with Buzzsprout. It's the platform I use, and it makes publishing, promoting, and tracking your episodes so easy, even if you're not tech savvy. Plus, they help you get listed in all the major directories like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and more. And here's the best part. When you sign up for a paid Buzzsprout plan using my affiliate link, you'll get $20 off and you'll be supporting the show at the same time. Just head to the description of this episode to find the affiliate link. Now, let's get back to the episode.